This is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday. Today is July 14th, 2017, and of course July 14th is an important date. In fact, modern European history sometimes is dated from July 14th, 1789, which was when the French Revolution began, when citizens of Paris, France, tore down the Bastille. That was a huge stone with 13 towers fortress in Paris that was used by the monarchy of France to, incarcerate people who did things that the kings didn't like. So today is Bastille Day. And I'm going to be featuring the life of my mother, Lois Elizabeth Hatch Dymel Washburn, including parts of a history that I wrote a number of years ago about her. She has been gone now for since 1959, when she died of cancer, but she was born 115 years ago this year. She was born in 1902. So here goes. In the fall of 1940, Lois Washburn moved from Tonopah, Nevada to Fallon, Nevada to work for the U.S. Employment Service, which at that time had an office in City Hall. Except for a few years, her home remained in Fallon until her death in September 1959. But before settling in Fallon, Lois Washburn had an adventurous life, living in Kansas, Oklahoma, California, Mazatlan on Mexico's west coast, in New York City, and in Nye County, Nevada, which she represented in the Nevada legislature, the assembly, for one term after her election in November 1936. Lois Elizabeth Hatch was born on January 11, 1902 in Clyde, Kansas. Her mother, Elizabeth Mary Ranney Hatch, born February 3, 1871 in Agenda, Kansas, also near the Nebraska border, was 30 years old when her second daughter, Lois, joined the family. We have a picture of the family a little bit later on, which shows Lois as in high school, as she was in Kansas in the teens of the last century. And the picture also shows her sister, Alice, and her oldest sister, Josephine. The two parents, Elmer, they're in the middle there, Elmer Ellsworth Hatch, and her mother, Elizabeth Mary Ranney Hatch, and then her three brothers, Lawrence, Worth, and Dean at the bottom. And as I say, my mother is the one up at the top on the left. Elizabeth Ranney was the oldest child of John H. and Mary Josephine Manning Ranney, a daughter of homesteaders from Catskill, New York, on the Hudson River. Lois Hatch's maternal grandmother had been only 16 years old when her first daughter, Elizabeth Ranney Hatch, was born. John H. Ranney, her father, 25 years old at the time of the birth of his oldest child, whom he named for his late mother, Elizabeth Mary, had been born near New Albany, Ohio on January 8, 1846. He had served in the Civil War, 1863-64, in the 5th Independent Battalion, Ohio Volunteer Cavalry, and in the Ohio National Guard Infantry for the 100 days summer posting in Virginia on the James River in 1864. He had taught in New Albany and attended business school in Columbus before homesteading and teaching in Kansas. 7 additional Ranney children followed. After 2 years at normal school in Emporia, Kansas, Elizabeth Ranney continued teaching for several years before marrying the Northern Baptist minister Elmer Ellsworth Hatch. Lois Hatch's father was named for the first famous Northern martyr of the Civil War, Colonel Elmer Ellsworth, born in northern New York State, but a friend in Illinois of President Lincoln. Ellsworth had been killed in Alexandria, Virginia, in April 1861. E. Hatch was born in Battenville, Washington County, New York, up north, on February 15, 1862, a son of Kenyon Crandall and Mary Foster Hatch. He moved with his father when he was a teenager in 1876 to California. And until his 30th birthday, Elmer helped tend his father's pear orchard near Lafayette, California, not too far from Berkeley and Oakland. Eager to attend college, he went east and was among the first graduates of the University of Chicago, newly founded by the Northern Baptist tycoon, John D. Rockefeller. Elmer sang tenor in the quartet of Chicago's Northern Baptist Divinity School. Elmer and Elizabeth Hatch raised a musical brood. Lois had a fine soprano voice and a lifelong wish to learn to play the piano. Lois Hatch's parents married on September 28, 1898, in Clyde, Kansas. Her mother recalled austere days for a new minister. Once, company arrived while dinner, which was only going to be 2 beautiful large potatoes, were baking in the oven. The company stayed so long that they were finally invited to share the meal. Elizabeth calmly placed the food before her husband, saying, "Please carve the potatoes." Lively Lois early exhibited a willingness to perform in public. As a toddler in a baby carriage, she would sing loudly but tunelessly during hymns in church. She was a favorite of her father for her independent ways. Lois had dark green eyes and hair that was almost black, but she had fair skin and related being teased as turkey egg for her childhood freckles. Lois always remembered the dusty farm in Gate, Oklahoma, where her family lived from 1908 to 16. In that Oklahoma Panhandle community, she sometimes could not walk outdoors without smashing grasshoppers with her bare feet. As a high school sophomore, she lived with her grandmother and uncle, Elliot Ranney, in Topeka, Kansas. Lois recalled making fudge while grown-ups were away, but grandmother would discover her secret gluttony because telltale sugar would crunch underfoot when M.J. Ranney, her grandmother, would walk into the kitchen. A traumatic event of Lois's childhood was a fatal accident that struck down her brother, Tim, or Manning Hatch, born in 1903. He was killed by a runaway team of horses before the family's horrified eyes in the spring of 1911, when he was only 8. Father Elmer also had a bad accident which left him lame. Lois's other sisters and brothers were Josephine, 1899 to 1989, Alice, 1905 to 1981, and Worth, 1907-1980. Those two were both born in Brock, Nebraska. During the 3 years, the Hatches were there in Nebraska, where E. Hatch was Baptist minister. Dean, 1909 to 1985, and Lawrence, 1911 to 1988, were born when the Hatches were in Gate, Oklahoma. Most of the family moved to California late in 1916, with teenagers Josephine and Lois staying in Kansas to finish their high school years, and then taking an adventurous week's railroad trip west in summer 1917. A joint photographic portrait of the Handsome family was taken in Lockford, California. And I think we've seen that picture already that shows the 6 children of Elizabeth and E. E. Hatch. Elmer had finally given up trying to scratch out a living on the dry Great Plains, and expecting a legacy of his father Kenyon's Lafayette pear orchard, went to Contra Costa County in California, only to discover that his brother-in-law had taken the title to the place. They were rescued, a homeless family, by his cousin, Ora Hatch Allen, in Lockford, California, in central, between Sacramento and Stockton. Then, after living in nearby Lodi on Lee and West Lockford Streets, Elmer Hatch bought a 19-acre place 5 miles west of Lodi, long a center of Tokay grape cultivation. Because of the passage of Prohibition, he and his boys grubbed out the big old grapevines, a heartbreaking and backbreaking job. He built a dairy barn there late in the 1920s. The land was rich, fruit and vegetables did well, and in summer the Hatch teenagers could work in the Lodi packing sheds or canneries. Lois finished high school in 1919 when the victorious Allies were dictating the Peace of Versailles to the Germans. At that heady time, it appeared that the world had been made safe for democracy. Demon rum had been banished with Prohibition, and the 19th Amendment to the Constitution to give women the vote was nearing adoption later in 1919. Full of idealism, Lois wrote the commencement song for her high school class. Our motto was printed in the high school yearbook, the Tokay. And this is what it says. To strive through all life's journey long, an upward path to keep, to lend a helping hand and strong, inspire with purpose deep, to teach in purity and love the message from above, to make the world a service field, our motto, not to yield, to seek the light of liberty for all the weak and wronged, to help this age-old earth to be a world with brothers thronged. And as we strive this goal to reach, the law of justice teach, the sword of courage always wield, our motto, not to yield, to find the worth of high ideals that sway the good and great, to heed a needy world's appeals, to break a binding fate, a worthy wish for true success that's crowned with happiness, and honor for our guardian shield, our motto, not to yield. In September 1919, ambitious Lois entered the University of California in Berkeley. She worked her way through college, exchanging free room and board for housework for the mother of her friend, Lorena Olson Kyle. They lived at 2913 Bancroft in Berkeley. And she was also hustling ads for the advertising department of the Oakland Tribune. Majoring in English, she was graduated in 1923 and aspired to become an author and newspaper woman. In 1921, Lois Hatch met her future husband, Ed Dymel, who was also working his way through college, although he came from a wealthy family. Very tall, blonde, and blue-eyed, the popular young man's hobby was movie making, and he worked summers at Yosemite. Born in San Francisco on March 3, 1902, Edgar Bertram was the 4th son of Dr. Henry Dymel, a native of Hamm, Germany, who had attended medical school in Chicago. Ed's mother, Carmelita Bosicki Dymel of Santa Barbara, died a few days after the birth of Edgar, her 6th child. But Dr. Dymel soon married again and had 5 more children. In the 1890s, Dr. Dymel had invented a process which wove a blend of linen and cotton into a fine mesh material. At one time, this magic fabric lined the shoes of England's King Edward VII, and Dymel linen mesh underwear retail stores were operating in London, Montreal, New York, San Francisco, and Düren, Germany. The Dymel stores in London and on San Francisco's Union Square were the last to survive World War I and the Depression. Ed Dymel spent part of his childhood at the family's English mansion. Today, Shortlands, as the house was called, is a stop on the London Underground system, and nearby Bromley is the extreme southeast section of Greater London. Despite his wealthy upbringing, Ed suffered from tubercular kidneys from drinking the milk of infected cows in England. This cost him a major operation for removal of a kidney late in the 1920s and ultimately led to his death when the remaining kidney failed in December 1937. Lois and Ed were married on September 28, 1923, her parents' silver wedding anniversary, and she wore her mother's wedding gown. They then took a steamer, probably sailing from San Pedro, to Mazatlan on the west coast of Mexico. I think we have a picture of Mazatlan, which is quite a picturesque spot. It was a place on the west coast of Mexico where ships came in from China. The steamship company for which Ed was working was the Mexican State Line. He got the job through Henry Grady, an economics professor at the University of California, who became the brother-in-law of Edgar's older brother, Henry Dymel. Grady was associated with the American President Line, but eventually moved from the San Francisco business community into diplomacy and served as ambassador to Iran in the 1940s. Another personal contact would be instrumental in the eventual move of Lois Washburn to Nevada. As a teenager, Ed Dymel attended Palo Alto High School, and the family lived in Los Altos. A high school friend was Carl Schaup, who attended Stanford University and later was a well-known economist at New York's Columbia University. Carl's father, Paul Schaup, was executive vice president of the board of the Southern Pacific Railroad. With a group of associates, Paul Schaup owned Pahrump Valley Ranch in southern Nevada between Las Vegas and Death Valley. A number of photos and postcards from the nearly 4 years of the newlywed Hatch-Dymel menage in Mazatlan still survive. Their college artist friend, Squire Knowles, visited Mexico for 2 months, probably in 1926, and painted an oil portrait of Lois Hatch-Dymel with her 1920s bangs and bob, in a blue long-sleeved blouse with a banana tree, lattice, and Mexican charcoal stove in the background. The Dymels lived in a comfortable U-shaped house with all rooms except the bedrooms having 3 walls. The fourth side of each living room opened onto the patio, which formed the center part of the U. The house was on a hillside street, backed up to a rock outcrop overlooking the bay side of Mazatlan, and just down the hill was a big warehouse and wharf, an island looming up in the bay. Lois's sister Josephine spent a long, happy visit of nearly 12 months in Mazatlan in 1925-26. Her stay was in part repayment for financial aid that trained nurse Josephine had provided Lois during her college years. Mementos of Mazatlan wound up in 1940s Nevada. Etchings of a Mexican niño with his large sombrero and a niña in her ruffled white skirt and blouse, a straw bandito doll with cartridge belts crossed across his chest, the fine white woolen shawl that Lois embroidered with colorful flowers, and 2 bright striped wool serapes. Also a color photograph of a ruined mission, and 2 small antique cedar chests, one covered in red and the other in black leather, studded with brass nails that had long ago brought shawls from China to Mexico, since Mazatlan was Mexico's main Pacific port. and the large carved cedar chest, stained black, made in 1924, that sat in all the living rooms Lois Washburn ever furnished. Another bit of Mexico was a sapphire ring with its dark blue oval surrounded by small diamonds. It was a wedding gift from Ed Dimel's employer. During her second marriage, Lois Washburn wore that ring, reset from silver to gold, with a wedding band given her by George Washburn. Mexico in the 1920s was just really almost still in revolution. Gun running or other smuggling might have accompanied the more regular steamship passenger and freight operations for which Ed Dimel served as accountant. Squire Knowles recalled that at the request of his doctor, Lois sent a bottle of tequila with a friend going back to the States. There was prohibition at that time, of course, in the States. Lois remembered midnight swims in the Pacific and the lights and excitement of carnival time. She was acquainted with General Flores of Sinaloa State, unsuccessful candidate for president of Mexico in 1924, who was mysteriously poisoned 18 months later. Business prospects were good in Mexico in the early and mid-20s, but by 1926, business troubles for the steamship line after completion of a railroad line and possibly Ed's need for a kidney operation brought the time in Mexico to a close. Lois returned about 1927 to her parents' home in Lodi to take education courses at the College of the Pacific in Stockton, California. About this time, Lois bought the old house on West Lockford Street from her parents. Probably in the spring of 1929, Ed and Lois moved to New York City, where they worked for the Dimel Linen Mesh Company. Ed's oldest sister, Elma McCutcheon, lived in New York, and also his younger sister, Ginny, and husband, Hans Stauffer, of the chemical company family. The Ed Dimels also exchanged visits with his maternal aunt's sons, Felix and Renee Wurmser, one a successful lawyer, the other associated with mining companies. In the winter of 1929, Lois's brother Worth, who was 5 years her junior, joined them in the city. For some time, their home was a fashionable apartment, Sutton Place South, in the shadow of the bridge linking Manhattan with the Bronx across the East River. On the next floor up was the apartment of automobile heir Walter Chrysler. The elegant skyscraper named for his family had recently been erected. On Sundays, the Dimel household would have a fine roast, but would then live on leftovers much of the rest of the week. Often Worth's close friends from Macy's, where all 4 young men were employed as night watchmen, would come to dinner as well. Among these was Michael Fleming, later in advertising and originally from Virginia, Minnesota, north of Duluth. Mike's sister, Mary Van Cleve, and brother Edmund Fleming would join the Dimels and Worth Hatch at Pahrump Ranch in Nevada in the mid-1930s. For several years, Ed worked for the Dimel Company. So did Lois, who wrote advertising for the firm and once ran the Montreal office for 2 weeks in the summer of 1930. She and her sister, Alice, who was attending Eastman School of Music in Rochester on a radio scholarship, were on vacation in Canada at the time. Lois took a course in design at Columbia University and, as an accomplished seamstress, tried her hand at fashion designing. She used Dimel linen mesh dyed with tasteful, cool patterns of yellow and green to make casual dresses and blouses. A glamorous picture of her modeling one of these dresses survives, and I believe we have a picture of her, 2 pictures of her actually, one showing her in Mexico after California, and one that was showing the dress. There we go, yeah, She's on the left in her beaded gown, and she's on the right wearing a Daimel linen mesh outfit from about 1930. In December 1931, she addressed the New York City Advertising Women's Club, feeling afterwards that her good talk had brought the firm some new business. Ed had some unfortunate dealings with his older sister's husband, Charlie McCutcheon, of the fashionable retail store on Fifth Avenue near St. Patrick's Cathedral. The Daimel Company's fortunes had peaked before World War I. All business had been affected by the crash of October 1929 and the subsequent depression, and the Daimel Company was no exception. With encouragement from McCutcheon, Ed was responsible for his father, Henry Daimel, losing his position as head of the firm which he had founded. Times were hard in 1932. Iowan turned Californian President Herbert Hoover was an engineer turned philanthropist during World War I from Stanford University. He had headed the Department of Commerce in the 1920s, but by 1932, out-of-work men huddled in the cardboard shanties of Hoovervilles cursed the luckless president. From her window, expectant mother Lois could see ragged men furtively going through garbage cans in hopes of finding something to eat. Meanwhile, in Albany, New York, Governor Franklin Delano Roosevelt began dreaming of the White House. Shortly before the Democratic convention that nominated FDR, Lois's first child was born on June 20th, 1932, at the Women's Hospital on Manhattan's Lower East Side, the doctors O'Regan in attendance. New Uncle Worth and new Aunt Alice Hatch came to see the addition to their family and lovingly nicknamed her Dolly. The new mother had confidently referred to the expected baby as John for some months. Circumstances put her at a loss to use that name, so she named the baby Lois Elizabeth for herself. Often she called the little girl Loisita, or Little Lois, Loisita, using the Mexican diminutive. Once in the gray fall of 1932-33, Dolly had been out getting some sun on the fire escape. When her basket was taken back in, a large cigar ash was found on the blanket. Obviously, mogul Walter Chrysler had casually flicked his cigar ash out the window directly upstairs. The doctor told Mother Lois in the gloomy winter of 1933 that her baby was at risk for soft bones or rickets. In those days, before vitamin D milk, cod liver oil and sunshine were the only sources of the vitamin D needed for strong bones. In the fall of 1932, Ed had already gone back to the better climate out west, trying his hand at real estate in Lodi with Mr. Wren and living with his Hatch in-laws on their ranch to the west of Lodi. Then in late January 1933, Ed Daimel began managing the Southern Nevada Pahrump Valley Ranch owned by the father and associates of his boyhood friend, Carl Schaup. So the two Lois Daimels moved to that clime where, in the words of the new president FDR's favorite song, Home on the Range, the skies are not cloudy all day. Late in March 1933, Lois and 9-month-old baby Dolly set out by train for Pahrump Valley in southern Nye County on the trail between Las Vegas and Death Valley. And I think we've got a map that shows Nevada. Yes, and that very big spot there, that very big county, is Nye County. On the trail between Las Vegas and Death Valley is the Pahrump Valley with its artesian wells. In the summer of 1934, Lois Daimel stayed with her parents in Lodi while taking education classes at summer school in Stockton. Then Lois and Loisita took a business and pleasure trip to Los Angeles, They saw the Dimels' friends, Dr. and Mrs. Audrain, met with the owners of Pahrump Ranch, and also stayed with Elizabeth Hatch's widowed sister-in-law, Leora Ranney. Lois wrote her mother a long letter dated August 10, 1934, which was forwarded to Sister Alice Hatch in Rochester, New York, and later recovered at Alice's home in Fairfax, Virginia, 56 years later, 1990. And here's the letter. And we're going to have a picture here that shows me and my mother. Lois says, I had an elegant time in Los Angeles. Here is a detailed account. The Audrains met us and took us out to their grand home. That afternoon, July 29, 1934, the Cadogans, he lately of Mazatlan, and she back but 3 months, came out and we all went to a beach house, once belonging to a movie actor, but now for sale, which the Audrains contemplated buying. After braving the Pacific Ocean when it ran up on the sand, Dolly did not care for the beach because the water ran up the sand and got her all wet. Well, we had prosaic hot dogs and then went back to Hollywood for Sunday night supper. Next day, I simply herded the child to see that she ruined no good furniture. Then on Tuesday, I went to Aunt Leora's, Mrs. Louis Ranney. She wanted so to see us because I figured I could get into the ranch by phone, probably, only on that day. Tuesday, I also ran around seeing all the owners of Pahrump Ranch and trying to collect some money. Mr. Sam Bishop was particularly swell and sent me up to the company dentist to have my teeth fixed for nothing. While in his office, Jim Kelly, right-hand man for Paul Schaup, came in. He gave us the latest dope from Washington on the State of the Union, i.e., that it is improving. Senator Tom Johnson, it was said, would be out before fall. Don't think that happened. And Rexford Tugwell is just a pretty boy. Wednesday I dined, and I mean dined. Colored maid, huge gold earrings, sherry, thick silver, thin silver, etc., with Mr. Isidore Dockweiler's secretary, a gray-haired maiden lady, friend of Mrs. Schaup. Dockweiler Jr. is a California congressman, Democratic. We went to a movie in Hollywood of little girl actress and gangsters. I think that must have been Little Miss Marker with Shirley Temple. That afternoon, Lorena Olson Kyle, my college friend, took me to the beach at Santa Monica with an adorable friend of hers who lived near Aunt Leora. That night I stayed home. Tuesday night I did too and was introduced to the Utopian Society, which my cousin Ivor was interested in. When I got in on Wednesday from my dinner date, however, I found there was a chance for a ride up to the ranch. So in the morning, I rushed around and madly trying to get home at 1 o'clock. I had to have 2 teeth filled and the baby's picture taken. I had her hair cut first, and she raised a terrific rumpus. Wouldn't ride on the elevators, wouldn't let me put on a new dress, etc., etc. Simply yelled while waiting for the photographer. Finally, he got through and could talk to us, and he had a mitt like a kitten on his hand. Dolly loved it and smiled into the camera beautifully. And there I am on the screen doing just that, sitting next to my mother. Then I rushed to the dentist and left Dolly in Sam Bishop's empty office with the boy stenographers right next door, while I went to the dentist. The dentist said I should have bridges on both upper jaws because there's a tooth gone on each side. He says I can't chew my food well with both those teeth gone. Well, they misdirected me to the streetcar line, so when I finally got home, my ride to Pahrump had waited for me for 13 minutes and then left. So I called up my friends and we did more things. I'd canceled a dinner and symphony concert in the Hollywood Bowl for that night, so I called up and the date was on again. Lorena and 3 of her married girlfriends. It was all Wagner program, Sir William Hartley conducting. And for the first time, I enjoyed Wagner. Friday night, I had dinner with Lorena. Saturday, I washed and ironed and ate at home and went to a utopian meeting, first and second cycles, with Cousin Ivor. I slept through most of it, and it made him mad, but not very mad, he said, or I couldn't sleep at his house that night. But I did anyway. Sunday, I went to Angela's temple in the morning. Reba Crawford in a traily, clinging silk gown and high-heeled white sandals pranced up and down in the pulpit, clanging a tambourine. She sat in a large carved chair, a blue bib of some stiff fabric decorated by a white cross, and she wore a cape that revealed rather than concealed as she hurled herself about the pulpit. She looked like a nightclub hostess, really. After dinner, Ed's little red-haired actress friend, Dorothy Garnier, came over, and we went over to the Audrains and watched Mrs. Audrain can and make jelly. Dorothy had a new second-hand car she'd bought for $200. It made me want a car. So I went right down to look them over. You see, Pahrump always spends gobs of money on gas, and if we had a decent, comfortable car, I could go and attend to business, which Ed used to see about, but which I must now see about, or leave to George Ishmael, inasmuch as Brother Bud, Worthhatch that is, does not like to go gadding about the desert. So I looked at cars and finally decided on one cheap but expensive to run, but very comfortable, a '28 Cadillac. Next morning, having collected $115, I bought it. That night I had supper at Tom Dymel's, that's a younger brother of Ed, and the next day I took Lois to downtown again, and Lorena brought her children, and we lunched together. That night I dined with Dorothy and went to the symphony again, this time conducted by Jose Iturbi. It was supposed to be a mixed program with Beethoven's Seventh Symphony, some Spanish dances and whatnot, but instead we got some more Wagner. I was really disappointed. I was supposed to go to third and fourth cycles of Utopia, but had decided that the Beethoven Seventh Symphony would set me up more for my return to the desert. So then I was finished with my visit in Los Angeles. On Tuesday, I said my goodbyes to the Audrains. The doctor gave me a health certificate to put in my teacher's application. I got only B's for my summer school work, by the way, at the College of the Pacific. I said goodbye to the owners, and early Wednesday, I left for the ranch in my new used car. I was about 120 miles away at least. I left at 9, and 12 hours later arrived at the ranch, tired and dirty, my eyes bloodshot from watching the road, one tire punctured by glass and changed in Yermo, the distributor point head cracked and changed in San Bernardino, costing $2.75, and the radiator overflow pipe cleaned out by Standard Oil friends in the station in Victorville. The drive across Death Valley was after dark, but I stopped twice to cool the engine in the grade. It heated up because there was a tailwind, they told me, in Shoshone. So here I am back at the ranch. It's lousy with people, and I get bored with it. I'm just home one day. But I'm looking up a writing job. I've got my music, politics, and a good chance for the school. So I should keep busy. And that was her adventure and my adventure in Los Angeles, 1934. Clarabelle Jim of Las Vegas remembers Lois Dymel as her first teacher at Pahrump, probably in the fall of 1934. Clarabelle also watched her great-grandmother, who was a Paiute Indian, Mrs. Whispering Ben, making willow baskets. And we've got a picture of that willow basket there. This is really a landscape. On the bottom of are the tracks of coyotes That's, of course, it's turned over, so you see the coyote tracks on the bottom. And you see the diamonds around the middle. Those stand for mountains. Those are the mountains. And then around the very top, there are raindrops and lightning all the way around that beautiful little willow basket, which is a souvenir of Pahrump. This old Paiute woman lived at Pahrump when Lois Daimel was there and must have been born about the time of either the Great Nevada Silver Rush in 1859 or during the Civil War when Nevada became a state in 1864. In February 1935, Lois's father, Elmer, enjoyed a visit at Pahrump and did some work around the place. But later that spring, he died there. His body was returned for burial in the family plot at Harmony Grove Cemetery at Lockford, near Lodi, where Lois Washburn would also be buried 24 years later. Lois's interest in politics blossomed in 1935. In June 1936, she attended the Democratic Convention in Philadelphia as representative of half of Nevada and was named vice president of the women's section of the National Democratic Party. That fall, she ran for the Nevada legislature to represent Nye County, which at the time had 2 representatives. She was elected in November 1936. 2 other women had represented Nye County in the 1920s. An eyewitness description of Pahrump in 1936 was written in a 1986 letter written by Dorothy Waring, who happened to go to Pahrump in 1936 because her fine arts dean at Cornell University suggested a high desert cure for her chronic sinus illness. Cornell librarian Dorothy Riddle had recently stayed at Pahrump's Dude Ranch for her Nevada divorce and recommended the place to sophomore student Dorothy. In a 1986 letter, Mrs. Waring wrote this memory of Pahrump. Pahrump was an oasis. There was a clearing before the little general store and post office. Across and down the road near the gate which one enters coming from Las Vegas was the schoolhouse. We always knew when the Paiutes were coming when we heard their tin Lizzies rattling across the desert. The school had trees around it, and there was an open swimming pool down a trail nearby. There were polo ponies to ride. Worth Hatch was very tall, dark, and handsome. He would have made it an even better Rhett Butler than Clark Gable did. Ed Daimel seemed even taller to me, being built more solidly, but still well built. He was blond with a big nose and blue eyes, gentle. He was a gentleman through and through. When I got to Las Vegas, he picked me up at the Hotel Sal Sagev, which is Las Vegas backwards, for the 100-mile drive to Pahrump. Still about Pahrump. Near the dining room was a watering trough where I could hear the water tinkling continuously because of the artesian well water. It was particularly beautiful at night. There were many large palm trees, and beyond the house there was a grove of enormous fig trees. I remember Lois Daimel as petite, dark, exuding energy and tension, dark hair drawn back tight, eyes dark and sharp. In my memory, all the men seemed to have been slow when compared to Lois. After I was rested up, in October I helped her campaign, mostly envelope stuffing. I also remember we used to drive to Tonopah for a Saturday night dance. It seemed like 350 miles. Well, it probably was, 175 up and 175 back. In early December 1936, Worth Hatch married the newly divorced Alicia Wallace, whom he had met while she was vacationing at Pahrump in 1935 with her son, Jim Wallace. At that point, Worth left Pahrump, which was being turned over to new owners. Within weeks of winning the election, Lois Daimel divorced Ed Daimel. On December 26, 1936, she and George Washburn, a highway engineer and motor grader operator who had worked on the roads near Pahrump, were married in Reno by a well-known Methodist minister who wrote a column for the Nevada State Journal newspaper. Lois's new husband, George Washburn, was born October 5, 1899, in San Luis Obispo, California, and named for George Dewey, the hero of the Spanish-American War of Manila Bay, who had just been honored with a huge welcome home parade in New York City. After the Newlands Reclamation Act was passed in 1902, the Washburn family moved by covered wagon from Central California to Derby on the Truckee River in the canyon east of Reno. There a dam was built to divert water to the new irrigation project going up on a dam built on the Carson River near Fallon. Squire Thomas, Tom Washburn, hailed from Illinois, and his wife, Mary Evelyn Campman, had come as a little girl from Germany. George was the sixth of the surviving children, Bill, Dan, Lily, Cleveland, Henry, and had three younger brothers, twins Wes and John, and Dugan. George owned a little ranch west of the home place where an orchard of apple trees grew, and his brother, Dan, lived with wife Fay and three sons. In 1936, Mary Washburn was still alive and living in the solid little house of railroad ties that her sons had built for her in the 1920s, where brother Wes Washburn would continue to live until the late 1980s. Upstream a few miles on the Truckee River lay the little ranch owned by the Irish-American McCarran family, whose only child, Patrick, had become U.S. Senator in the mid-1930s. After Pahrump Ranch was sold, Dolly went to California with her daddy Ed. He insisted on custody of her as a condition for the divorce, but taking care of a 4-year-old proved pretty difficult for a single man. So in March 1937, he returned the little girl to his former wife, and they agreed that Dolly would spend summers with Ed and winters with Lois. Early in 1937, the new Lois Washburn went to Carson City, white with the heavy snows of that hard winter, to serve in the legislature. She had an ambition to pass legislation that would help women. As it turned out, Lois Washburn would be one of only 4 women to serve in the Nevada Assembly in the decade of the 1930s, despite the passage of women's suffrage. Lois and her new husband, George Washburn, moved into a little house on Prospect Street in Tonopah, where George, who was a jack of all trades, could do electricity, carpentry, fix cars, etc., built handsome cupboards into the little kitchen. Just up Mount Bruffer was the Knights of Columbus Hall, built of dark desert stones and looking like a mysterious castle. In the summer of 1937, Lois Washburn had a tumor removed by Dr. Audrain in Los Angeles. She was relieved to find that it was benign, and the operation helped her health problems. Dolly spent that summer of 1937 at Lake Tahoe with her daddy Ed, but he died of kidney failure on December 17, 1937, and was buried in Phoenix. In the spring of 1938, the Washburn family of 3 lived in a homemade trailer pulled by George's dark green Chevrolet pickup. He was working on roads in Beatty, Round Mountain, Silver Peak, and Manhattan. Dolly went to school that year in Derby, although she was only 5, but all the other kids where she was staying were going, so she went too. And she also went to school in Beatty and Tonopah. During the Czech crisis in the fall of 1938, the family was without radio or newspaper in the semi-ghost town of Taibo, 60 miles east of Tonopah. George Washburn had been mining with Roscoe Vassar, whose wife Libby was a Williams of the pioneer family, that lived on Hot Creek near dark, foreboding Mount Maury, just about 12 miles from Taibo. Joe Williams, her brother, kept the 4 horses Lois Washburn salvaged from the breakup of Pahrump. In Taibo, Lois Washburn taught just 3 students, her daughter in 2nd grade, and Hope and Kay Vassar, sister and brother, Roscoe and Libby's children. The desert canyon, with its pungent odor of sagebrush, held the Washburns' hillside cabin. But in November, Lois Washburn landed a patronage job in the U.S. Employment Service, and the family moved back to Tonopah and Prospect Street. Events that rocked the world in 1938-39, the Spanish Civil War, the Czechoslovak crisis ending with the agreement at Munich, Hitler's March 1939 seizure of Prague, the crisis over Danzig, and the invasion of Poland that opened the Second World War were far, far away. But they sparked sensational stories in the papers, and Lois, that's me, remembers the first headline she ever read, had to remember, that said, "Will Hitler die in 1940?" In those days of U.S. isolationism, Senator Key Pittman chaired the Foreign Relations Committee of the U.S. Senate. He lived in Tonopah, and more impressive to many in Tonopah at the time was the fact that the Pittmans had one of the only 2 lawns in town, because you need a lot of water to have a lawn. Green grass was truly a luxury of the 1930s Tonopah. In the fall of 1939, Lois Washburn bought for $50 a house overlooking the town higher up on Mount Bruffer on the top street, Eureka Street, just under the T for Tonopah. Once from the high porch, smoke could be seen rising from a burning mine on Tonopah's other mountain. Mount Bruffer rises steeply, and while the back door was level with the hill, the front had high steps and was a pioneer split level. Under the living room was an earthy-smelling dark room, little better than a basement, with its own door onto the street. There Lois Washburn established the wall of books that accompanied her to all the houses she ever furnished. After the Washburns left Tonopah, that house burned or was moved. In the fall of 1940, Lois Washburn moved to U.S. Employment Service job in Fallon, Nevada, living in a 2-room pioneer house on East Richards Street, across from the Kents, who owned the big general store in Fallon. But soon her talents would be more needed in Hawthorne, the county seat of Mineral County, 70 miles south of Fallon, the site of the Naval Ammunition Depot on Blue Walker Lake, which sparkles between Tonopah and Fallon. The naval station there had been authorized in 1928 because, although close to the west coast, Hawthorne was isolated. If a big explosion took place, no large population center would blow sky high. Nevada's senators had the clout to bring defense industry to the state. Tonopah's Key Pittman headed the prestigious Foreign Affairs Committee, and another Democrat, Pat McCarran, wielded national power, especially later on during the 1950s when he became a noted hunter of political reds. Place and politics aided Nevada, as they have so many other U.S. towns depended on the military over the years since 1940. The threat of war put the final quietus to the depression that had stifled the U.S. economy for 12 years. In the fall of 1941, Lois was driving to Hawthorne once a week. The workforce there was gearing up, and she was interviewing men and processing job applications. Soon George Washburn, who for years had worked on desert roads with a motor grader, was building more roads at Hawthorne, connecting the storage bunkers for ammunition. The spring after Pearl Harbor found the Washburns jammed into war boomtown Hawthorne in a dark 1-room jerry-built, tar paper-covered so-called tourist cabin, one of a cluster of similar shacks at the dead end of a Hawthorne street. This was years before the advent of fancy motels. But in June, they moved to a tiny but brighter, lighter cabin that George built in the yard of a big house across from high school. After school, Dolly helped by handing him nails to hammer into the light yellow boards. Back in Hawthorne in the spring of 1986, when Lois and her daughter Alice saw that after nearly 45 years, that cabin was being used for storage and seemed unbelievably small. But the tiny house was a happy place in the summer of '42, with a new baby, William Du Bois Washburn, born on Mother's Day, May 9, 1942, named for his father's oldest brother, Bill. His middle name honored great-great-grandmother Lana Du Bois Manning and the other maternal forebears from New York's Catskill region on the Hudson. 3 weeks premature, the baby boy was delivered by cesarean section in Fallon Hospital by Doc Sawyer when Lois Washburn was already 40 years old. The infant's first 2 weeks were spent in an incubator because he was less than 5 pounds at birth. Despite a shaky start, and there were fears at first that Lois's kidneys had failed, mother and son were soon doing well. Now, Hawthorne, we've got a memento of Hawthorne, Mineral County High, which looks like a sea serpent. There it is. And the year 2000, I went to my high school reunion, and I was the farthest away person at the meeting. So I won the sea serpent. Supposedly there was a sea serpent in the Walker Lake, but that, of course, was just just a story. There's one other thing to show, which is the plaque from Tonopah, where we lived for a number of years, and that shows the Desert Queen Mine in Tonopah. This was given to me when I became a life member of the Central Nevada Historical Society. I'm a life member of several other historical societies and very interested in genealogy, which is why I've been telling you part of this story of my mother's life, Lois Hatch Dymel Washburn, today as part of our Women Today and Yesterday. She died, as I mentioned before, in September of 1959, but she did have a chance to see her first grandchild, my son Dickie. She was able to play piggy toes on his little toes. He was only 4 months old, and she died the next day. This is Lois Whaley, and there's a picture of me again with my mother when I was age 2 in Los Angeles. This is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday.